Hello, my friends. Today is the last day of Arthurian April. It is day 30. And I thought a lot about what I could talk about today. There's so much that we haven't covered. There's so many stories that we've only just scratched the surface of. But if there is one piece of literature I would leave with you, there's definitely no other one that I would choose. That is, of course, The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which there is almost nothing else. One of the critics that I was reading earlier today said that there may not be a finer fantasy book ever written, and I kind of have to agree with that as well. So to understand the story and to understand the author, and I think one of the reasons that I connect so much is that The Once and Future King, all the little novellas that make up the larger piece, really hit this balance of what I find so compelling in Arthuriana. And it's a mix of the sort of zaniness, the sort of oddness, the wit that shines through even over 1,000 years later, but also a sense of profound sadness. As I've definitely mentioned before, the world of Camelot is in decline. We all know that the story doesn't end well, and yet somehow T.H. White is able to make that experience absolutely unforgettable. Now, T.H. White was born in 1906 in India, which was at the time, of course, one of the British colonies, and lived through an incredibly traumatic childhood with parents who were abusive. His father abandoned his family. His mother was awful. They had a very high profile divorce because at the time divorce, was a pretty big deal. And he somehow managed essentially to go through the horrendous English boarding school situation and then put himself through Cambridge, after which he became a teacher. But he was writing and publishing in this time period leading up to the Second World War, where the world was a very scary place. And one of the things that I learned today that I didn't recall from times that I'd read about him was that he was very well known for a wide variety of deep but fleeting interests. These interests were very widespread, everything from falconry to flying planes to clearly Arthuriana. As a fellow ADHD person, that just absolutely screams to me that there's a reason that I've connected so much with his work. He was also someone who, throughout his whole life, suffered with a sense of isolation and loneliness. He never married, he never had any children, he was an only child. There are quite a lot of speculations about his sexuality, various opinions. His biographer was pretty insistent that he was, but other friends said that he wasn't. Either way, he was a very lonely man. But he was also a man who had a lot of love in him. And if you want to just cry yourself silly, you can read some of the letters that he wrote after his beloved dog passed away and how much that absolutely broke his heart. And to him, it was breaking his heart. Like he says it, like it was like losing your wife, your child, your cousins all in once, because this dog had been, the light of his life. That said, I am thankful that at one point in the 1930s, he picked up a volume of Malory and the take on Le Morte d'Arthur, and that inspired him, and he felt that he was so amazed at how this story from so many years ago had a beginning and a middle and an end, that there were character arcs, that there were, that there was characterization through the whole story, and he was really enchanted with it and wanted to write his own version. The books that make up The Once and Future King are sequential, and they follow very much like Malory, but thankfully not as many chapters, the sort of important points of the stories. If you ever saw the Sword in the Stone Disney film, that is based on the first book. So The Sword in the Stone, The Lady of Air and Darkness, The Candle in the Wind, and The Ill-Made Night, but The Ill-Made Night is before The Candle in the Wind, are the 4 books that were compiled into The Once and Future King. Posthumously, they also published the Book of Merlin. Most famously, The Sword and the Stone, we are introduced to Merlin, who is definitely the Obi-Wan figure, right? He's the one that is teaching Wart, young Arthur, all the things that he needs to know to be a great king, and discussing constantly the philosophical ramifications of having potential power, might versus right, which is something that I think the world today is still struggling with, and many, many other themes. The writing is so beautiful in T.H. White's works that you sort of get lost almost immediately. And it's dense, but it's dense in a way that is so full of character, so full of spirit, often so hilarious that you are just absolutely transported to another place. And it is full of anachronism, which is totally fine. This is clearly a man of the 20th century writing about a medieval time. And so, with the character of Merlin living backwards, you get even more of that. To give you a little example, this is from The Sword and the Stone, where we have Arthur and Merlin lying down in the field while Kay is doing a bunch of training. And just like in the cartoon, he's a total brute. And Arthur is kind of thinking about all the training that Kay is doing for being a knight and wishes something else for himself. Merlin says, what were you thinking? He says, oh, it was not anything. I was thinking about Kay learning to be a knight. And well, you may grieve, exclaimed Merlin hotly. A lot of brainless unicorns swaggering about and calling themselves educated just because they can push each other off a horse with a bit of stick. It makes me tired. Why, I believe Sir Ector would have been gladder to get by our lady tilting true for your tutor, that swings himself on his knuckles like an anthropoid ape, rather than a magician of known probity and international reputation with first-class honors from every European university. The trouble with the Norman aristocracy is that they are games mad. That's what it is, games mad. You get a lot of these little interjections and hilarious moments, especially from Merlin in the first book, that are just so riotous and so wonderfully British, but also a wonderful commentary on the sort of Mallorean world of Arthur on top of this world that he's trying to build that is more built on reason and sort of whimsy and magic. The story, though, does get progressively more sad. And through all of the subsequent pieces and sort of the rise of Mordred as this very vengeful son who clearly hates his father, and you see the sort of build up to the whole Mordred Arthur stand down, which is pretty common in a lot of the stories. You still follow along because you believe that there can still be magic, that right will actually win over might, but it doesn't quite happen that way. The musical Camelot is also based on this, but it is definitely more of a lighthearted take, even though it does have some more serious pieces. It's a wonderful film if you see it. It was also a Broadway musical. Now, so T.H. White, also known as Tim to his friends, did live long enough to see success from his books. So he didn't have to teach anymore. Obviously, he managed to make it in some ways through World War II and all the challenges of that time. He saw the cartoon and the musical based on his work, but he definitely never had sort of his own peace. He remained very, very alone and suffered from alcoholism and likely other struggles, and pretty much died alone. But there's so much beauty in the work that he left behind. And to me, that is in some ways the best that you can ask for. We'll never really know exactly what his life was like. There are some biographers, there's some of his papers that you can access as well. But in terms of me being born in this time and being able to have read this, I don't think I would have written my books if I hadn't read The Once and Future King. And I remember so specifically being on the bus in college, reading the end of the story and just crying. But they say maybe Arthur will come again. Who knows? I know that next year during Arthurian April, I'll do this all over again. Thank you so much for tuning in.